A flight attendant force-fed soap to a black teen instead of water. 1 minute later, the CEO jammed the whole bottle down his throat. What happens next will leave you speechless. He poured soap into a baby's mouth, thinking no one would rise against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The hiss of the jet bridge disconnecting echoed faintly through the cabin as Adrian Keene adjusted the soft blanket draped over his sleeping infant son. He moved with care, precision in every gesture, cradling the small bottle of warmed milk in one hand, its contents just reaching the right temperature. The cabin of Silverwing Airlines' first-class section glowed with ambient lighting, hushed conversations flowing around him like gentle waves. Overhead bins thudded closed with the practiced rhythm of a well-rehearsed departure. But amid this calm, a single glance sliced through the peace. From the galley near the front of the aircraft, the chief flight attendant, Julian Carr, watched Adrian with thinly veiled disdain. His uniform was flawless, gold wings pinned perfectly over his chest, yet his eyes carried something sharp, impatience, superiority, something colder than mere annoyance. Adrian met the gaze for a second before looking away, pretending not to notice. He knew that kind of look. He'd seen it in boardrooms and hotel lobbies, that practiced mask of politeness wrapped over a deeper judgment. But this wasn't a conference table. This was a flight, and in his arms, his son slept unaware, fragile and deeply loved. As Adrian gently swirled the milk inside the bottle, Julian strode past with a clipped step, brushing close enough that the scent of expensive cologne and a hint of bitterness trailed behind him. "Let's try to keep the premium cabin undisturbed this time," Julian muttered under his breath, though just loud enough to be heard. He didn't break stride. The words hung in the air like a dropped glass, quiet but unmistakable. Adrian exhaled slowly, keeping his calm. He glanced down at Noah, whose lips moved slightly in his sleep, instinctively sensing the bottle nearby. The CEO leaned back into his seat, firm in his decision to ignore the provocation. He wasn't here to pick a fight. He was here for the investor summit in Geneva, a speech that could lock in a billion-dollar merger, set his company on a global trajectory. But more than that, he was here to keep his promise to Noah, to keep moving forward even after the storm that had taken his wife. The cabin lights dimmed as the final safety instructions played, and the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Outside the window, night had fallen, the airport glowing with distant rows of amber lights. Adrian's mind drifted to his keynote presentation, rehearsed and restructured countless times. But the moment he felt his son stir again, his focus snapped back. Noah's small fingers clenched around Adrian's thumb, a tiny grip that anchored him more than any business deal ever could. The engines roared, and the plane lifted, pressing passengers gently into their seats. The world tilted, and for a few long seconds everything felt suspended, between sky and ground, past and future. Then came the first cry. It started small, just a whimper. Adrian instinctively reached for the bottle, whispering gentle words as he rocked Noah. But the baby's face scrunched, a soft gasp rising into a louder wail. He was hungry and disoriented, the sudden altitude shift unsettling his tiny system. Adrian inserted the bottle carefully, hoping to soothe him quickly, but the movement drew attention. Julian turned sharply from the galley, his brow already furrowed. He approached with brisk steps, his polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the carpeted floor. "Is everything under control?" he asked with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Adrian nodded politely, bouncing Noah in his arms. "Just feeding him. He'll settle." Julian's gaze dropped to the bottle in Adrian's hand. "We do ask that passengers avoid warming milk with personal thermoses. It can be considered a hazard." "I used the in-seat warmer," Adrian replied evenly. "It's allowed." Julian didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow breath, then offered a theatrical sigh. "I'll bring you something more suitable. Cleaner." Before Adrian could object, Julian turned and disappeared behind the curtain into the galley. Adrian stared after him, unsettled by the sudden shift in tone. Something about the exchange left him cold, not just annoyance but a whisper of something darker. Around him, other passengers avoided eye contact. A suited man 2 rows ahead pulled his headphones over his ears. A younger man across the aisle stared out the window. No one said anything. Moments later, Julian returned, a different bottle in hand. "This one's been freshly prepped." "For the baby," he said, offering it with that same unreadable smile. Adrian hesitated, eyeing the bottle. It looked normal. He could feel Noah growing more distressed, his cries louder now, more desperate. The stress of the upcoming summit and the exhaustion of single parenthood swirled like smoke in his chest. After a pause, he accepted the bottle and gently replaced the old one. Noah latched immediately. For a second, silence. Then came the cough. It wasn't a normal baby cough. It was sharp, sudden, almost explosive. Noah's body jolted in Adrian's arms, his limbs going stiff. His eyes widened and a garbled sound escaped his throat. Foam bubbled from the corners of his mouth. "Noah!" Adrian's voice cracked. Panic seized him as he lifted the baby upright. "Noah!" Passengers turned. One woman gasped. Another shouted for help. The scent hit him then, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. Soap. Adrian's eyes darted to the bottle Julian had handed him, now rolling on the seat. The faint film inside it shimmered under the overhead lights. Noah's face twisted in pain, tiny hands trembling. Julian stood frozen for a heartbeat, then smirked. "Babies," he said under his breath. "They need to learn discipline." The cabin erupted. A man jumped to his feet, calling for a doctor. A flight attendant nearby screamed for the defibrillator kit. But Adrian only saw one thing: his son, convulsing in his arms, his cries silenced by froth and fear. And Julian, unmoved. In the blur of chaos, one truth crystallized inside Adrian's soul. This was no accident. This was no mistake. It was malice. And in that moment, everything shifted. The calm before disaster often looks like nothing at all. Noah's cries split the cabin air like cracks through glass, sharp and relentless. His tiny chest rose and fell with jagged effort, fists balled in distress as the plane leveled into its climb. Adrian adjusted him gently in his arms, his voice low and soothing. "It's all right, Noah. It's all right," he whispered, rocking him slowly. He reached for the bottle of warm milk he had prepared moments earlier, his motions careful, deliberate, the practiced tenderness of a father who had learned to balance business and fatherhood in every detail of his life. But before the bottle could reach Noah's lips, a shadow fell across them. Julian Carr's hand shot forward, swift and uninvited, plucking the bottle from Adrian's grasp. The movement was theatrical, as though he meant to perform for an unseen audience. "Spoiled fathers and their crying children," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt but loud enough for several passengers nearby to hear. His eyes, narrow and sharp, glared down at Adrian with an air of authority that felt less like duty and more like disdain. Adrian blinked in disbelief, his jaw tightening. "Give that back," he said, his tone steady but edged with warning. His fingers twitched as if to reclaim the bottle, but Julian had already taken a step back, turning with an exaggerated sigh that carried across the cabin. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in a gray suit raised his brows but quickly lowered his gaze when Julian's sharp eyes flicked his way. A young traveler in the opposite row reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it down again. No one spoke up. The hum of the engines filled the silence, amplifying the awkwardness that pressed down like a weight. Julian disappeared toward the galley, his uniform shoes clicking against the floor, his posture rigid yet smug. Adrian sat frozen, his arm around Noah, trying to soothe him with a gentle pat to his back. Inside, unease gnawed at him. Something in Julian's tone lingered, a bitterness that went beyond annoyance at a crying child. Minutes later, Julian returned. In his hand was a different bottle, similar in size, but the liquid inside shimmered strangely under the cabin lights, too clear, too perfect. He held it out with a practiced smile that felt more like a sneer. "Here." "Cleaner. Safer," he announced, his tone falsely reassuring, his eyes daring Adrian to question him. Adrian's brows furrowed. He stared at the bottle for a beat too long, his instincts whispering against reason. The businessman in him, accustomed to reading faces across boardroom tables, caught the glint of something malicious hiding behind Julian's eyes. Still, distraction pulled at him, his open laptop, the slides he had yet to polish, the mounting weight of the investor summit that could change his company's fate. He hesitated, the conflict gnawing at him. Trust his instinct or dismiss the unease as paranoia. Noah's cries grew sharper, his tiny body writhing in Adrian's arms, demanding comfort. Against his better judgment, Adrian accepted the bottle. His hand trembled slightly as he guided it toward his son's lips, every nerve in his body screaming that something was amiss. The first sip was met with silence, then another, then sudden chaos. Noah's eyes widened, his face scrunching as if fire had touched his tongue. His small body stiffened, his legs kicking violently against Adrian's arm. A strangled gagging sound tore from his throat. Adrian jerked upright, panic surging through him. "Noah!" he gasped, pulling the bottle away. The sharp, bitter scent hit him instantly. Soap, a stench that clung to his nostrils and churned his stomach. His heart slammed against his ribs as realization struck. Noah convulsed, foam bubbling at his lips, his cries replaced by choking gasps. Adrian's vision blurred, rage and terror colliding. He clutched his son to his chest, patting his back, tilting him, desperate to help him breathe. "Somebody, help!" he cried, his voice breaking through the stunned silence of the cabin. Passengers bolted upright in their seats. Gasps filled the air, followed by the metallic snap of seatbelts unclasping. A man shouted for a doctor. Another fumbled for his phone, torn between recording and assisting. The air that had once been thick with indifference now crackled with panic. And through it all, Julian stood at the aisle's edge, arms folded, his expression cool, almost satisfied. He leaned in ever so slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper sharp enough for Adrian to hear. "Babies need to learn discipline." His lips curled into the faintest smile, cruel and unflinching. Adrian's world narrowed to the image of his son's tiny frame trembling in his arms, the froth spilling from his mouth, the weight of helplessness pressing into his chest like iron. His eyes lifted, locking on Julian's. Fury sparked through the fear, a flame that would not die. The cries of passengers, the rush of footsteps, the roar of engines, all blurred into background noise. What cut through was the sight of Julian's cold stare, unshaken, untouched by the chaos he had wrought. And in that moment, with his son's life slipping between breaths, Adrian felt the truth carve into him like a blade. The rules had changed. His purpose was no longer the summit, the speech, or the billion-dollar deal. It was survival for Noah and reckoning for the man who dared to harm him. In one moment, milk had turned into poison. Noah gagged violently, the sound sharp and unnatural, as if the small child's lungs were filled with fire instead of air. Foam burst from his mouth, thick and bitter-smelling, flooding Adrian Keene's senses with terror. His heart lurched as he clutched his son closer, shaking him gently but urgently. "Noah, breathe. Please, breathe for me." His voice cracked, carrying both command and desperation. The hum of the engines became a distant roar, drowned beneath the chaos rising through the cabin. A doctor seated 2 rows behind surged forward, his jacket slipping from his shoulders as he knelt in the aisle. "Lay him flat," the man barked, his hands trembling only slightly despite the urgency. Adrian complied instantly, lowering Noah onto the narrow seat cushion. The infant's tiny chest heaved weakly, each breath a broken gasp, the sound hollow and fading. The doctor pressed 2 fingers beneath Noah's jaw, tilting his head, then lowered his ear to the child's lips. "His airways compromised," he muttered, the words tight with strain. Adrian watched every move with the raw intensity of a man trying to memorize life itself. The sharp scent of soap stung Adrian's nostrils, unmistakable and cruel. He turned his head sharply toward Julian Carr, the chief flight attendant, who stood a few feet away. Julian's arms were crossed, his mouth twisted into the ghost of a smirk. "What did you give him?" Adrian demanded, his voice echoing through the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers shifted in their seats, their whispers forming a wave of dread. Julian's reply was cold, his tone soaked in mockery. "You're overreacting." Babies cry. Maybe he just couldn't handle a bottle properly. His words slithered into the air, cruel in their casualness. Gasps erupted when the doctor lifted Noah's chin, his fingers brushing the child's lips. White residue clung to them, sticky and foaming. "This is soap," the doctor announced with horror, his eyes flashing up toward the crew. His voice broke the silence like glass shattering on tile. Passengers leaned forward in disbelief, a chorus of voices rising in shock and outrage. One businessman seated near the middle row fumbled with his phone, recording every detail, his lens capturing Julian's smirk even as Adrian begged for answers. No, this isn't possible," Adrian whispered, though he knew it was. His chest tightened, fury mixing with helplessness as if his very blood had turned to iron. He dropped to his knees beside Noah, his hands hovering above the baby's trembling body, terrified to touch, terrified to lose. "Stay with me, son. Please stay with me." His words, broken and fragile, filled the tense air with unbearable weight. The intercom crackled, the captain's calm voice stretched thin with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are diverting for an emergency landing. Please remain seated." But to Adrian, the minutes stretched endlessly, each second carving into him like a blade. His world had collapsed into the fragile rise and fall of his son's chest, the rhythm too faint, too slow. Julian remained unmoved, his chin tilted defiantly, his stance a cruel mirror of arrogance. "This is nothing more than dramatics," he sneered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His words landed like poison darts, stinging and sharp. The dramatic irony hung heavy. The man passengers once looked to for guidance was now revealed as the very architect of disaster, while Adrian, the brilliant CEO known for unshakable control, was left powerless, reduced to a father clawing against despair. The doctor pressed his palm gently over Noah's chest, his face pale with worry. "His breathing is weakening. We need to land now, or—" He did not finish the sentence, but the silence afterward was louder than any word. Adrian's hands clenched the seat's armrest so tightly the leather groaned beneath his grip. He forced himself not to scream, not to give Julian the satisfaction of seeing him break completely. Instead, he turned his eyes toward his son, memorizing every fragile line of Noah's face, every twitch of his lips, every tremor of life struggling to remain. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers muttered prayers under their breath, others shook their heads in disbelief. Yet none dared confront Julian, whose uniform still carried authority, a false shield that kept justice at bay. Only the businessman's quiet recording lens stood as witness, capturing the truth that words alone could not hold. Adrian's thoughts spiraled, a torrent of fury and helplessness. He had built empires with nothing but strategy and willpower, dismantled rivals with precision, and turned challenges into victories. Yet here, before a single cruel man and a poisoned bottle, he was undone. His brilliant mind could not untangle soap from a baby's lungs. His wealth, his power, his intellect, all were meaningless against the fragility of life. And in that void of helplessness, something new was born, a vow that the cruelty unleashed upon his son would not fade into silence. Noah stirred faintly, a tiny whimper escaping his throat, and Adrian seized it like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Tears blurred his vision, but behind them, fire burned, a promise, unyielding and absolute. He lifted his gaze, fixing it on Julian with a stare that cut sharper than any blade. The smirk on the flight attendant's lips no longer seemed untouchable. It was the mask of a man who would one day choke on his own arrogance. The cabin shuddered as the plane dipped lower, engines whining with strain. The descent promised safety, but time moved sluggishly, indifferent to human desperation. Adrian pressed his palm against the small rise of Noah's chest, feeling for each faltering beat, whispering prayers that were less of faith and more of fury. He was no longer a man rushing to a summit. He was a father at war with cruelty itself. And deep within, where no one else could see, he carved a vow upon his soul. This act would not go unanswered. Every detail, every second, every mocking word from Julian etched itself into Adrian's mind like iron brands. He would remember it all. The cries, the choking, the foam, the sneer, the helplessness. It was not only Noah's survival at stake, it was the dignity of every father who had ever watched his child suffer under the weight of cruelty. And as the cabin filled with the sharp scent of soap and fear, Adrian's grief transformed into a weapon waiting to be wielded. Every second stretched like a blade pressed against his soul. The plane jolted downward, the cabin rattling as oxygen masks quivered from their compartments. The sudden descent sent a ripple of fear through the passengers, but Adrian Keene barely noticed the turbulence. His entire focus was on the fragile rise and fall of his infant son's chest. Noah's breaths were faint, shallow gasps that faltered more with each passing second. A thin sheen of sweat formed on Adrian's forehead as he pressed his ear close to Noah's lips, desperate for reassurance. The faint sound of air passing through his son's throat gave him only a flicker of hope, a flicker that grew dimmer by the heartbeat. Julian Carr, the chief flight attendant, slipped away toward the crew's quarters, his polished shoes clicking against the aisle floor with an urgency he tried to disguise as authority. But Adrian saw it for what it was, cowardice. He stepped forward, blocking Julian's path with a forceful grip on the man's arm. "You don't walk away from this," Adrian said, his voice low but filled with a dangerous weight. His eyes burned with restrained fury, every muscle in his jaw clenched tight. Julian attempted to yank his arm free, his face contorting into a mask of irritation rather than fear. "You need to control yourself," he snapped, raising his voice just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're scaring people." His words carried an air of false authority, the practiced tone of a man used to silencing complaints. But Adrian did not waver. His fingers tightened, his stance immovable. "Why?" he demanded, the single word cracking through the tense air. "Why would you do this to a child?" Passengers nearby leaned in, whispers spreading like sparks through dry grass. Some urged caution, their nervous glances darting toward the cockpit door. Others shouted for accountability, voices breaking under the strain of fear and anger. The cabin had become a courtroom, every seat filled with an uneasy witness. Julian stumbled back, pressed against the narrow wall of the galley. His veneer of composure cracked for the first time. His lips curled, not in remorse, but in bitter contempt. "Infants don't belong on flights like this," he muttered, his tone venomous. "They're parasites of luxury travel, crying and disturbing people who paid for peace. Someone needed to remind you of that." The words landed like a blow to Adrian's chest, colder than the air spilling from the vents above. Gasps erupted from the passengers, and one man near the aisle muttered, "Did he just say that?" The revelation was more than an insult, it was a confession. This was not an accident, nor a lapse of judgment. It was hatred, deliberate and simmering, exposed under pressure. Adrian's breath slowed, his fury sharpening into a dangerous calm. His instincts screamed to lash out, to drive his fist into Julian's smirking mouth, but his mind, honed by years of corporate strategy, held him back. Striking now would give Julian an escape, a way to twist the story into one of aggression instead of cruelty. Adrian understood in that moment that vengeance, to be lasting, required patience. He swallowed the storm raging inside him and stepped back, eyes locked on Julian as though branding the man's face into memory. The doctor kneeling beside Noah looked up, his voice urgent. "He needs immediate hospitalization," he said, his hands pressing rhythmically against the child's small chest. "We can't stabilize him here." Seconds matter. His forehead glistened with effort, and the desperation in his voice pushed Adrian's heart further into a pit of dread. The landing gear screeched beneath the plane, the sound vibrating through the cabin as if the very aircraft cried out in warning. Red and yellow lights flickered above the aisle, casting the passengers' faces in a ghostly pallor. The pressure of the descent pressed them back into their seats, but Adrian leaned forward, clutching Noah tightly against his chest. The baby's body was limp, but Adrian whispered into his ear as though his words alone could anchor his son to life. "You're going to make it," he murmured, his lips trembling against Noah's forehead. His voice was low, steady, carrying both comfort and a darker promise. His free hand curled into a fist against his knee, the knuckles white with strain. In his mind, he replayed Julian's words: parasites, disturbance, luxury, and the cruelty carved deeper than any wound. It would not be forgotten. Julian adjusted his uniform, trying to stand taller, but the passengers' stares pinned him down. His arrogance had not faded, yet his smirk now seemed thinner, stretched too tight across his face. He turned away, muttering about procedures and misunderstandings, but Adrian's vow echoed silently through the cabin, sharper than any accusation. As the wheels screeched against the tarmac, the smell of scorched rubber flooding the cabin, Adrian's resolve crystallized. He rocked Noah gently, pressing his cheek against the child's head. The noise of emergency vehicles roaring toward the runway barely registered. His mind was already far beyond this descent. He was no longer just a father begging for survival. He was a man who had been wronged in the most unforgivable way. The vow, whispered into Noah's ear, was not only for comfort, it was a declaration, a line etched in stone. If his son lived, Julian Carr would one day know the taste of his own poison. Sometimes revenge is born in silence, not screams. The aircraft slammed onto the runway with a violent jolt, wheels screeching as the cabin lurched forward. Overhead compartments rattled, glasses shattered, and passengers clutched their seats, hearts pounding from the sudden descent. Before the aircraft had fully slowed, emergency vehicles sped alongside, their red and blue lights strobing through the cabin windows like a warning beacon. The smell of burnt rubber from the tires mixed with the stale air of panic. Within seconds, the doors burst open and paramedics charged inside, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, their voices sharp and commanding. Adrian's arms tightened instinctively around Noah's fragile body, his chest aching with the shallow rise and fall of the child's breaths. The baby's skin had turned pale, a lifeless gray, and the faint foam clinging to his lips seemed to mock Adrian's helplessness. "Please, help him." Adrian's voice cracked, raw with desperation as he thrust his son toward the first paramedic. The man, his face stern and focused, carefully lifted Noah onto the stretcher, his gloved hands moving with the precision of someone who had carried too many lives balanced between survival and death. The stretcher wheeled down the aisle, its metallic frame squeaking under urgency. Adrian followed, his strides uneven, torn between the weight of grief and the fire of rage. His suit, once immaculate, was stained with soap residue and damp from Noah's tears, each mark a reminder of his failure to protect. Yet just before crossing the threshold of the cabin door, he halted. Something compelled him to turn back. There, leaning casually against the bulkhead as if the world had not just tilted into chaos, stood Julian. His arms were folded across his chest, his posture smug, his lips curled into that same infuriating smirk that had haunted Adrian since the moment this nightmare began. It was not the look of a man shaken by his actions, but of one who relished his own cruelty. For a fleeting instant, their eyes locked, the gaze of a father fighting for his child's life against the cold disdain of a man who believed himself untouchable. Adrian's hands trembled, torn between lunging forward to strike him and racing after the stretcher. His breath caught in his throat, fury clashing with restraint. And then, as though fate intervened, a hand brushed against his arm. The businessman seated a few rows back, the one who had filmed everything, slipped a small device discreetly into Adrian's palm. "The world will see this," the man whispered, his voice steady but his eyes wide with the weight of what he had done. Adrian glanced down at the phone, the screen faintly glowing with the paused image of Julian's smirk captured mid-act. It was not merely a recording, it was evidence, a weapon sharp enough to cut through lies and corporate shields. Adrian's fingers curled tightly around it, the plastic biting into his skin, anchoring him to a new resolve. He turned once more toward Julian. The chief flight attendant raised his chin, the smirk widening as though mocking Adrian's powerlessness. But beneath that arrogance, a flicker of unease danced in his eyes. It was brief, almost invisible, but Adrian caught it. He said nothing, offered no promise of what was to come, only stared with a look that carried all the weight of unspoken vengeance. As the paramedics hurried Noah down the steps to the waiting ambulance, Adrian's body moved on instinct, following. Yet his mind spun with sharp, relentless precision. Years of leading corporate wars had honed his ability to see patterns, to anticipate outcomes, to strike not in fury but in calculated inevitability. And now, those instincts turned away from boardrooms and contracts to a single, burning purpose: judgment. At the base of the steps, the stretcher slid into the back of the ambulance. Noah's tiny frame seemed swallowed by the machinery around him, oxygen tubes, beeping monitors, hurried hands working to stabilize what little breath remained. Adrian climbed in behind, but as he did, his gaze caught sight of something on the service cart left at the cabin's edge. The bottle. Half empty, its label stained, the faint trace of soap clinging to its neck, the very instrument of his son's torment. Adrian reached out, his fingers closing around it. The plastic crackled beneath the force of his grip. In that instant, it was no longer just a container, it was a symbol, a promise, a reminder of the cruelty that had dared to touch what he held most dear. His knuckles whitened as he pulled it close, tucking it against his side like a relic of war. The line between father and avenger blurred with every heartbeat. The man who had boarded the plane seeking only safe passage was gone. In his place stood someone forged in fire and grief, a man who would not surrender his pain to courts or headlines. Justice, he decided, would not be delayed by bureaucracy or softened by excuses. It would be swift, direct, and unforgettable. He stepped into the ambulance at last, his eyes still burning from the sight of Julian's smirk, the phone heavy in one hand, the soap bottle in the other. His thoughts no longer trembled with fear but sharpened into resolve. He would not wait for courts or headlines. He would deliver judgment himself. Adrian paced the sterile hallway, his shoes clicking against the polished floor with a rhythm that mirrored the erratic beat of his heart. The white walls seemed to close in on him, their emptiness amplifying the chaos inside his chest. He could still feel the dampness of Noah's tears and the sticky residue of soap foam staining his suit. Every time he lifted his hand to wipe his face, the faint chemical sting of detergent lingered in the air. pulling him back into the moment of horror. Behind the heavy double doors, doctors fought to stabilize his son. Each muffled command and metallic clang of medical instruments struck Adrian like a hammer against glass, threatening to shatter what remained of his composure. The monitors beeped in irregular intervals, each note a cruel reminder of fragility. Adrian stood frozen at times, his back pressed against the cold wall, and then moments later found himself pacing again, as though stillness would mean surrender. He whispered to himself, not prayers but vows, promises that Noah would survive, that Julian would pay. His fists clenched, and though grief churned inside, his mind refused to collapse. It sharpened, like a blade forged in fire. A nurse emerged through the swinging doors, his face lined with exhaustion. Adrian rushed forward before the man could even adjust his mask. "Tell me," Adrian demanded, his voice hoarse, his eyes burning with desperation. The nurse lowered his gaze and spoke softly. "Your son is breathing again, but he hasn't regained consciousness. He is stable. For now, relief washed over Adrian like a fleeting tide, his knees almost giving way. He placed one hand on the wall for support, exhaling with a shudder that echoed through the empty corridor. But the relief lasted only a heartbeat. The fire inside him, ignited midair, refused to dim. He straightened, his jaw tightening, eyes narrowing into a stare that cut through the hallway's stillness. His son's survival was not the end of the ordeal, it was only the beginning of something far greater. Adrian turned to face the glass window overlooking the tarmac. The lights of the airport blinked faintly in the distance, a city of movement and order. Yet beneath that order, Adrian saw only rot, systems designed not to protect the innocent but to shield the powerful. He thought of Julian, smug and arrogant, waiting comfortably somewhere in the terminal, perhaps sipping water while Noah lay unconscious. The thought twisted his stomach, but it also solidified his resolve. The hiss of automatic doors broke his train of thought. 2 airport police officers entered the ward, their uniforms crisp, their boots polished. They carried the air of men certain of their authority. Adrian straightened his tie, preparing for justice at last. "Where is he?" Adrian asked sharply, stepping forward. "Where is Julian Carr?" "You have enough evidence to arrest him now." The taller officer, Sergeant Halden, exchanged a glance with his partner before replying, his tone unnervingly calm. "We've spoken with him. He's cooperating. We're following procedure?" "Procedure." Adrian's voice rose, cracking under the strain. He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "That man tried to poison my son. He force-fed him soap, and you call that procedure?" The second officer, younger and clearly uneasy, shifted his weight, but Halden remained composed, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, these matters are complicated. We need to wait for further instructions from our superiors. Interrogations must be handled carefully." Adrian's chest tightened, his fists curling so hard his knuckles whitened. He studied their faces and saw it, the hesitation, the subtle deference, the unspoken protection extended not to the victim but to the perpetrator. His voice dropped, colder now, more dangerous in its steadiness. "He's being protected, isn't he?" Neither officer responded. The silence was louder than denial. Adrian's breath slowed, his mind racing with the clarity of revelation. He saw it as plainly as he once saw corporate schemes unfold in boardrooms. Money had exchanged hands. Influence had been whispered across phone lines. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning exactly as designed, to protect men like Julian and silence fathers like him. He turned back toward the doors behind which Noah lay fighting, his reflection caught in the glass. A man disheveled, stained, broken on the outside but sharp and unyielding within. He had faced rivals who tried to dismantle his company, partners who tried to outwit him, and competitors who played with deception. Each time, he had found the weak seam, the hidden crack, and he had pulled until the structure collapsed. Now he saw Julian as no different, a man perched atop a fragile system of lies, waiting for the right hand to tear it all apart. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir. These things, they don't always work the way they should." Adrian studied him, then nodded once, not in acceptance but in recognition. The words were an unintended confession, proof of what he already knew. He turned back toward the hallway, his steps measured, his breath steady. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, though both officers heard it clearly. Justice was not broken. It was sold. Adrian pushed through the cluster of passengers still lingering in the terminal, their voices hushed, their faces pale with unease. The air buzzed with unspoken fear, the kind that hung heavy after a tragedy no one wanted to fully acknowledge. Mothers clutched their children closer, businessmen avoided each other's eyes, and young men who had shouted for justice on the plane now sat quietly, their courage swallowed by the looming shadow of corporate retaliation. In the far corner, beneath the sterile glow of the fluorescent lights, Julian Carr sat with an infuriating calm, a small plastic cup of water balanced carelessly in his hand. He tilted it to his lips, sipping slowly, as if savoring not the drink but his own arrogance. His eyes lifted, locking on Adrian's, and he smirked, a sharp, poisonous curve of the mouth that cut deeper than any insult. Adrian's fists clenched at his sides. For a moment his instinct screamed to storm across the terminal, to make Julian choke on his smile. But his mind, honed by years of high-stakes negotiations and strategic battles, seized control. Rage alone would not break a man like Julian. Precision would. He turned his back on the flight attendant, shoulders tight, and pulled his phone from his pocket. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the iron beneath it. "Marcus," Adrian said, "I need you here." Now, on the other end, Marcus Vare did not hesitate. "I'm coming." What happened? Adrian's gaze slid back to Julian, who now leaned casually in his chair, watching passengers scatter around him as though they were no more than frightened birds. "Bring nothing but your mind," Adrian answered. "We're going to build a storm." Minutes later, Marcus strode into the terminal, his presence sharp and controlled, the kind of man who commanded respect without raising his voice. He carried no briefcase, no files, only his unwavering loyalty and the sharp eyes of a strategist. Adrian met him halfway, thrusting the soap bottle into his hands. "This," Adrian said, his tone quiet but seething, "is proof. And this," he held up the businessman's phone, the screen glowing with the recorded footage of Julian's cruelty, "is the weapon." Marcus studied the bottle, turning it slowly as if weighing not just the evidence but the gravity of what it meant. His jaw tightened. This alone should be enough to bury him. Why isn't he in cuffs already? Adrian's eyes darkened. "Because the airline is protecting him." "You saw the police. Procedure," they said. "Procedure is nothing but a shield for men like him." Across the terminal, Julian shifted in his seat. He could not hear their words, but the sight of Adrian and Marcus huddled together, their heads close, unsettled him. He straightened, masking his discomfort with another sip of water, but his smirk wavered ever so slightly. Adrian leaned closer to Marcus, his voice dropping until it was barely more than a whisper. "If they think I am only a grieving father, they have underestimated me. I didn't build an empire by waiting for mercy." His eyes flicked to Julian, who was now pretending to scroll through his phone, though his fingers twitched with nervous energy. Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Then we need more than evidence. We need pressure. Witnesses, statements, voices louder than their lawyers can silence." Adrian nodded, already outlining the steps in his mind. They would gather the passengers, the businessman's footage, the doctor's testimony, all threads to weave into a net the airline could not escape. He imagined the headlines, the public outrage, the fury that no settlement could smother. It was not just about exposing Julian, it was about stripping away the armor of the entire system that enabled him. Yet beneath the careful planning, Adrian's emotions surged like a tide. He saw Noah's tiny chest rising and falling in that hospital bed, every breath fragile, every moment uncertain. He remembered the foam spilling from his son's lips, the helplessness that had hollowed him out. That helplessness had died the moment the plane's wheels touched the ground. Now, only resolve remained. Julian glanced up again, his smirk faltering as he caught the intensity in Adrian's stare. For the first time, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arrogance cracking at the edges. He could not know what Adrian was planning, but he felt the weight of it in the air, pressing down like a storm on the horizon. Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp. "What do you want me to do?" Adrian's reply was cold, precise. "Help me turn their silence into noise, and when it's loud enough, Julian will learn what it means to be powerless." The terminal hummed with tension. Every whisper, every glance, every nervous shuffle of feet feeding the storm Adrian was already conjuring. Julian sat rigid now, no longer lounging, no longer untouchable. He could not admit it, not even to himself, but a flicker of unease had taken root. Adrian leaned close to Marcus one last time, his whisper carrying the weight of a vow. If they think I'm only a father grieving, they have underestimated the man who builds empires. Julian noticed the whispered plotting and grew uneasy, sensing something was coming but not knowing how soon. The battlefield had shifted from the sky to the shadows. He left a black CEO's child unconscious, convinced fear would silence the truth. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Noah's small hand twitched, fingers curling around Adrian's index finger with the frail grip of a child barely clinging to awareness. The sterile hospital room was filled with the steady rhythm of machines, their beeping like an artificial heartbeat. Adrian leaned forward immediately, his eyes locking on the faint flutter of Noah's lashes. Relief crashed over him like a wave, but beneath it surged something sharper, a clarity that cut straight through the fog of grief and exhaustion. He bent close to his son's ear, whispering, his voice low and trembling with both tenderness and resolve. I promise you, Noah. I'll protect you. No one will ever hurt you again. The child's breath was shallow, fragile, but steady enough to ignite hope. Meanwhile, at the airport terminal, chaos spread like wildfire. The sterile order of the boarding gates had disintegrated into shouting, arguments, and panicked whispers. Passengers stood in small clusters, their voices rising against the officers who had been dispatched to manage the scene. Why hasn't he been arrested yet? One man demanded, his face flushed with fury. Another, clutching his phone, shook it in the air. We saw what he did. There's video proof. The officers, however, remained guarded and measured, repeating the same hollow phrase. We are following procedure. Their calm tones only fueled the crowd's outrage. Julian Carr, the man at the center of it all, seemed to thrive in the storm. He sat reclined in one of the plastic airport chairs, sipping from a paper cup of water with deliberate slowness. His eyes scanned the restless crowd with mock amusement, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Rich fathers can't scare me, he said loudly, tossing the empty cup aside with casual disdain. His voice carried just enough for everyone nearby to hear, turning anger into disbelief. A hush fell, quickly replaced by murmurs. Some passengers shook their heads, others turned away in disgust, but none dared confront him directly. His arrogance filled the room like smoke, suffocating those around him. Adrian returned to the terminal moments later, his expression carved from stone. His tailored suit was wrinkled, stained with Noah's tears and the bitter foam of soap, but his presence commanded attention. Marcus Vare, his operations chief and closest ally, was already waiting at his side. Marcus had spent the last hour scouring every source he could reach, whispers from staff, scraps of information from airline employees, hidden files brought into the open. He leaned close, his voice low but charged with urgency. I found it. Julian's record isn't clean. He's been reported before. Parents, passengers, even other crew members. Complaints buried under settlements, silenced with signatures and checks. Adrian's jaw tightened. He had anticipated resistance, but to hear confirmation of deliberate concealment made his blood burn. His eyes flicked to Julian across the terminal, who was still laughing softly at something only he found amusing. That laugh was a blade twisting deeper. They've been protecting him, Adrian muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They've let him do this again and again. The businessman who had filmed the incident approached cautiously, his phone clutched like a fragile secret. He glanced around nervously before speaking. I sent the footage to 3 networks already. They'll break it tonight. But the airline, he stopped, lowering his voice further. They've got powerful lawyers. They'll try to bury it before it spreads. Adrian nodded, his mind working like clockwork gears, every detail a piece of a larger strategy. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, some pleading silently for action, others avoiding his gaze for fear of being dragged into the storm. Dramatic irony filled the space like an unseen weight. Julian believed himself untouchable, wrapped in the shield of an airline too powerful to challenge, while Adrian already held the cracks of that shield in his hand. Marcus placed a folder into Adrian's grip. Inside were photocopied memos, corporate signatures, directives to quietly resolve complaints, notes on payouts that read like confessions in ink. Adrian's fingers traced the edges of the papers, his mind racing. This isn't just him, Adrian whispered. This is the entire system. His voice was calm, but behind the calmness was steel. Julian, noticing Adrian and Marcus in conversation, narrowed his eyes for the first time. His smirk flickered, replaced by a trace of unease. He stood and stretched his shoulders, masking the sudden tightness in his throat. "Plot all you want," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few to hear. "Nothing will touch me." Yet his hands twitched as he adjusted his uniform, betraying the crack in his confidence. The tension in the terminal was suffocating. Every passenger seemed suspended between fear and hope, waiting for someone to take control. Adrian finally raised his head, his gaze fixed on Julian like a hunter on prey. He leaned slightly toward Marcus, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. "If they think I'm only a father grieving," he said, his words like cold fire, "they have underestimated the man who builds empires." Julian froze where he stood, his smirk faltering for the first time, though he quickly tried to recover it. But the whisper of those words carried far beyond Marcus, sinking into the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Somewhere in the shadows of the airport the battlefield had shifted, though only one man understood the full weight of what was coming. Every empire hides cracks. He only had to strike once for it all to fall. Cameras flashed in a storm of white light as Adrian Keene stepped onto the platform of the hospital's media room, Noah cradled carefully in his arms. The space buzzed with the restless energy of dozens of reporters, their pens tapping against notepads, their microphones trembling in eager hands. The air was thick with the metallic scent of wires and hot lights. Every eye locked onto him, some hungry for scandal, others softened by sympathy. Yet Adrian moved with the controlled calm of a man who had already calculated every step before setting foot in the room. His suit was creased from sleepless hours, his face pale, but his presence carried the weight of both grief and resolve. He stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone with one hand while holding Noah close with the other. The child stirred weakly, breathing faintly against his father's chest, a living reminder of the crime that had brought them here. The murmurs quieted into silence. Adrian's gaze swept the room, catching the cameras, the journalists, and the flickering red lights that meant the broadcast was already live. His voice broke that silence like a blade through glass. "Tonight," he began, his tone steady but charged, "you will see what was done to my son on Silver Wing Airlines Flight 417. A ripple of anticipation moved across the crowd. Adrian lifted his hand, and a screen behind him came to life. The video played in brutal clarity. Julian Carr, uniform crisp and demeanor arrogant, force-feeding a helpless infant with a bottle filled not with milk, but with soap. Gasps erupted from the room. Reporters covered their mouths, pens froze mid-sentence, and the flashing of cameras became frantic. The sound of Noah choking, the foam spilling from his lips, and the cruel sneer on Julian's face filled the hall. Adrian turned his head slightly, watching the screen with them, though he had already burned every second of that footage into his memory. His jaw clenched, and when he spoke again, his words were sharp, deliberate, as if each syllable had been carved out of stone. "This was not an accident," he declared, his voice carrying a quiet fury. "This was cruelty." And it was not the first time he lifted a folder from the podium and opened it with a crisp snap. Inside were copies of documents, internal memos, complaint forms, witness statements, all pointing to a history of misconduct hidden beneath polished corporate walls. He raised one page high so that the cameras could capture it. "These are records of past abuse," Adrian continued, his tone rising with conviction. "Parents silenced with settlements. Complaints buried, and Julian Carr protected by the very company that should have held him accountable." The room shifted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions over each other, voices overlapping in a storm of urgency. "When did you get these documents? Will you sue the airline? Do you fear retaliation?" Adrian did not flinch. He waited, allowed the storm to swirl, and then raised his hand for silence. Slowly, the voices dimmed again, leaving only the sound of Noah's shallow breathing near the microphone. "I am not here tonight as a CEO," Adrian said, his tone lowering but striking deeper. "I am here as a father. And as a father, I cannot let this end in silence." The words carried a rawness that no corporate training could disguise. Adrian's eyes burned with an intensity that cameras could not soften. His objective was no longer a speech to investors. It was to ignite outrage so powerful that it could not be ignored, so relentless that the system itself would bend. Far away, in a guarded hotel room provided by Silver Wing Airlines, Julian Carr sat watching the broadcast on a flat screen. The curtains were drawn, the room dim, the hum of the television filling the silence. At first, his mouth twitched into a smirk, the familiar arrogance clinging like a mask. But as the video replayed his own face, smirking, cruel, unrepentant, that mask cracked. His eyes darted to the door, uneasy. The reporters' gasps, the rising voices, the outrage flooding through the broadcast were no longer abstract, they were judgment, and they were coming for him. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the hotel door, firm and deliberate. Julian froze, his throat tightening. The smirk slid away completely. He rose slowly, trying to steady his breath, his hand trembling as it reached for the door handle. Back at the hospital, Adrian finished his statement with a final blow, his voice dropping into a chilling calm. "The truth is no longer hidden," he said, "and the truth is this. No child should suffer what mine did, and no man should believe himself above justice." The cameras clicked one last time. The room held its breath. Adrian stepped away from the podium, holding Noah tighter as though shielding him from the world's hunger for spectacle. Reporters shouted, police moved quietly at the back of the room, and the flood of consequences had already begun. But in Adrian's eyes there was no victory yet, only the sharpened edge of something darker. The evidence had been revealed, the outrage unleashed, but he knew it would not be enough. Headlines might roar, courts might shuffle papers, but none of that would deliver the reckoning Julian truly deserved. The press conference was only the beginning. The foreshadowing sharpened with every step Adrian took away from the cameras, his thoughts already racing ahead to what must come next. Because he understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Microphones and documents could expose, but only a father's hand could balance the scale. Truth had been spoken. Now vengeance demanded its voice. Julian's footsteps echoed across the vast emptiness of the hangar, the sound sharp and hollow against the steel walls. The sliding doors had groaned shut behind him, cutting off the glow of the city outside. Inside, the air was heavy with oil and rust, the faint metallic scent of abandoned machinery lingering like a memory of battles past. He walked with the swagger of a man who still believed himself untouchable, his eyes darting across the shadows as if expecting lawyers or corporate allies to step forward from the dark. Instead, only one figure stood waiting beneath the weak cone of light cast by a single overhead bulb: Adrian Keene. Adrian's posture was rigid, his tailored suit wrinkled and faintly stained from nights spent at his son's bedside. In front of him, resting on a steel table, sat the object that defined this confrontation: the half-empty bottle of soap. Its label was torn, its contents dulled from use, yet its presence loomed larger than any weapon. Adrian's hand rested on the table beside it, his fingers steady, his eyes locked on Julian with a calm intensity that burned hotter than rage. Julian forced a smile, though his lips trembled at the edges. "What is this?" he asked, his voice carrying both mockery and unease. He spread his arms as if addressing an audience that wasn't there. "You lured me out here for a bottle of soap? You think this scares me?" His words bounced against the metal walls, sounding smaller than he intended. Adrian's reply was measured, his voice low but edged with steel. "I didn't bring you here to scare you. I brought you here so you could feel what helplessness truly means." He stepped closer, the sound of his polished shoes deliberate against the concrete floor. His eyes never left Julian's, and the steadiness in them unsettled the flight attendant more than any outburst ever could. Julian chuckled nervously, trying to regain control. "You won't touch me. You're too important for that. You've got a company to run, a public image to protect. Men like you don't get their hands dirty." He jabbed a finger in Adrian's direction, hoping the accusation would remind him of restraint. But Adrian didn't flinch. He picked up the bottle, holding it at eye level, letting the light catch the liquid inside. "You said once that discipline was necessary, that children need to learn the hard way. Tell me, Julian, what lesson did you think you were teaching when you fed poison to my son?" His words were calm, but beneath them ran a current of fury so deep it silenced the cavernous room. Julian's smirk faltered. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his confidence eroding under the weight of Adrian's control. He tried to laugh again, but the sound came out hollow. "It was a mistake." "Stress. Nothing more. You're blowing it out of proportion." He backed up a step, his shoes scraping against the dusty concrete. Adrian advanced, slow and steady, the bottle still in his hand. "Stress does not explain cruelty. Stress does not excuse watching a child choke while you smirked." His tone sharpened, each word delivered with precision, like a blade carving truth into stone. "You wanted power. Now you'll see what that feels like when it's taken away." The hanger seemed to shrink around Julian as he realized there would be no lawyers, no executives to shield him. He raised his hands, palms outward, his bravado collapsing into pleading. "Wait. You don't have to do this. You've already won. The world hates me. The airline is finished. What more do you want?" His voice cracked, desperation breaking through the mask. Adrian paused, the silence stretching so long it seemed to echo louder than words. Then he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice a whisper that struck harder than a shout. "I want balance. And balance is not given by courts or cameras. It's earned. Here." He set the bottle back down on the table with a deliberate thud, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a gavel. Julian's breathing grew shallow. He glanced at the doors, but they were sealed, the heavy steel locked from the outside. The flickering light above them buzzed faintly, casting shadows that danced across Adrian's face. Julian realized with dawning dread that this was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Adrian straightened, his silhouette tall and unwavering beneath the bulb. His voice deepened, carrying both grief and resolve. "You thought you could bury this in procedure. You thought you could hide behind uniforms and titles. But justice isn't found in their rules, Julian. It's found when a man answers for what he has done." The weight of the words pinned Julian in place. His lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. His confidence, his arrogance, his practiced sneers, all of it cracked under Adrian's unwavering gaze. The silence of the hangar pressed in on them, heavy and absolute, until only the sound of Julian's shallow breaths filled the air. Adrian moved back a single step, letting the moment settle like dust after a storm. His voice dropped to a final, chilling calm. "Some lessons can't be taught by law." And as Julian stood frozen, the doors groaned shut fully behind him, the metal locking with finality. The echo lingered like a sentence delivered. The stage was no longer a courtroom nor a boardroom. It was a cage of steel and silence where one man's cruelty was about to be measured against another's resolve. The hangar doors closed, sealing fate within. The hangar air was thick with the scent of oil and cold steel, every breath carrying the weight of rust and silence. Julian's footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete floor as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking like hollow warnings in the cavernous space. His eyes darted around, expecting the stiff posture of lawyers or the stern presence of police officers, but the hangar was nearly empty. Only one figure stood in the shadows, still and waiting. Adrian Keene emerged from the dim light with deliberate calm, his presence commanding the room without a single word. A flickering bulb overhead cast a wavering circle of light, illuminating the steel table at the center. Resting upon it, like a cruel reminder, was the half-filled soap bottle. Its plastic shimmered faintly, an object both ordinary and menacing. Julian froze for a moment, though he quickly straightened his back and tried to mask the sudden tightness in his chest. He smirked, his voice laced with mockery, though his tone quivered faintly beneath the surface. "You won't touch me. You're too important." His words hung in the air, brittle against the stillness. He crossed his arms, leaning back as if to show ease, but his eyes betrayed unease, flicking nervously between Adrian's steady gaze and the bottle that seemed to gleam like a weapon forged from memory. Adrian stepped forward slowly, his shoes scraping against the ground with a measured rhythm, each step deliberate, echoing like the toll of a bell. His face was calm, too calm, a mask carved by grief and sharpened by rage. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, a tone stripped of all unnecessary words. "Do you remember their cries?" he asked, his eyes burning as he fixed them on Julian. The choking, the foam, the silence that followed. Each phrase fell like a hammer, the weight of memory pressing against Julian's bravado. The smirk on his lips faltered for an instant, though he tried to recover it with a dismissive chuckle. He waved a hand, as though brushing away dust. "Overreaction," he muttered, his voice thin, forced into the air like smoke struggling to escape. It was nothing more than... But the words died on his tongue as Adrian's hand reached forward. He gripped the bottle, twisting the cap slowly. The faint squeak of plastic unraveling filled the room, louder than any shout could have been. For the first time, Julian's face shifted, his confident mask cracking as unease widened in his eyes. His throat tightened as he swallowed, the sound loud in the silence. His bravado slipped further with every second the bottle remained open, its bitter scent leaking into the air like poison reborn. Adrian's gaze never wavered. He lifted the bottle slightly, his grip steady, his movements controlled. He had no need to shout or rage. His calm was far more terrifying than fury. "Reckoning," he whispered, his words deliberate, each syllable heavy. "It is not about anger. It is about balance." He took a step closer, the distance between them closing like a tightening noose. Julian pressed back against the cold wall of the hangar, his earlier smirk dissolving entirely now into a mask of nervousness. Julian panicked, stumbling backward until his spine struck the cold steel wall of the hangar. The clatter of his shoes against the concrete floor echoed in the cavernous space, a hollow sound that seemed to trap him in the very corner he had tried to avoid. His smirk, once so unshakable, had vanished. Sweat beaded at his temples, trickling down his face as his chest heaved in uneven breaths. His voice cracked, no longer filled with arrogance but with desperation. "I was just stressed," he cried, his hands raised in a trembling plea, palms open as if surrender could rewrite the past. "It wasn't meant to go that far. I didn't mean." Adrian moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, the faint scuff of his shoes drawing Julian deeper into dread. There was no rage in his expression, no wild fury that Julian might have mocked. Instead, Adrian's calm was colder than steel, sharper than any blade. His dark eyes never left Julian's face, reading every flicker of fear and every desperate excuse as if they were lines in a script he had already memorized. "You didn't mean to?" Adrian's voice was steady, low, yet it carried across the wide room like a hammer striking an anvil. He lifted the soap bottle from the table, the faint squeak of the cap twisting open filling the silence. "You called it discipline. You called it teaching a lesson. Now you will understand what lessons feel like." Julian's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His knees bent slightly, his body shrinking in on itself as though he could make himself invisible. "Please. You don't have to do this. You're too important, too powerful. If you touch me, it ruins you." His words tumbled out in a rush, but they carried no conviction, only the stench of fear. Adrian closed the space between them, the overhead bulb casting their shadows long and uneven against the floor. Without warning, he shoved the soap bottle into Julian's hands, forcing the man to feel its weight. The plastic crinkled under Julian's grip, slippery against his sweaty palms. His fingers shook violently as he clutched it, staring at it as though it were a venomous snake. "Hold it," Adrian commanded. His voice remained quiet, but it carried authority, a finality that allowed no refusal. Julian obeyed, trembling, the bottle pressed against his chest. Adrian tilted it forward with one hand, the opening hovering inches from Julian's mouth. Julian shook his head frantically, his lips quivering, but Adrian's hand was unyielding. "For a moment," Adrian whispered, his tone laced with an icy calm that pierced deeper than fury ever could. "Just a moment. Taste what you gave to an innocent child." The liquid touched Julian's lips and his body convulsed. He gagged instantly, coughing as the bitter, stinging burn of the soap invaded his mouth. His hands shook so violently that drops splattered across his chin, foaming white against his pale skin. His eyes widened, bulging with terror, and he stumbled sideways, nearly falling to the ground. The harsh chemical taste coated his throat, burning as it went down, and he retched, spitting violently onto the concrete floor. "Stop!" Julian gasped, his voice breaking into a rasp. He dropped to one knee, clawing at his own tongue as though he could scrape away the poison. I can't breathe." Adrian stood above him, unmoved. He did not force more upon him, nor did he retreat. Instead, he watched, his expression unreadable. The power shift was complete. Where once Julian had loomed with arrogance and mocked helplessness, now he quivered on the floor, broken and humiliated. "You thought helplessness was a lesson," Adrian said, his tone low but clear. He crouched down slightly, his eyes fixed on Julian's crumbling form. "You thought cruelty proved strength. Look at you now, weak, begging, stripped of everything you hid behind." Julian coughed violently, his body shaking as he gasped for air. His hands trembled against the floor, his once pristine uniform smeared with sweat and spit. He looked up, his voice barely more than a whimper. "Please, no more." "I understand." Adrian leaned closer, his words precise and cold. "Do you? Because this is what it means to take away power, to strip someone of control. This is what it means to feel helpless." He straightened, his shadow towering over Julian like judgment itself. Julian collapsed fully onto the floor, his chest heaving, His pride shattered into fragments scattered across the concrete. The soap bottle rolled from his hands, spinning briefly before clattering to a stop against the wall. His eyes flicked toward it in horror, as if the object itself carried the memory of what he had done. Adrian's gaze lingered for a moment longer, and then he spoke the final words with a cold certainty that cut through the silence. "Now, you know what helplessness feels like," Adrian said coldly. Julian collapsed on the floor, trembling. The reversal was complete. Predator turned prey, arrogance turned terror. The soap that once silenced a baby now silenced its master. The video spread faster than fire in dry grass. Within hours, every major news outlet had the footage of Julian's smirk vanishing in the hangar, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of Adrian's carefully orchestrated confrontation. Anchors debated furiously on live television. Some called Adrian a man of unshakable resolve, a father who had stared cruelty in the eye and returned it with equal force. Others, stiff in their suits, argued that he had crossed a line, blurring the difference between justice and vengeance. Comment sections swelled with voices divided, but the one constant was this: the world was watching, and silence was no longer possible. Inside a courtroom weeks later, the echoes of that leaked footage clung to the walls like an unseen presence. Reporters clustered outside the entrance, their cameras flashing against marble pillars, while protesters chanted in the streets, holding signs that demanded accountability not just for Julian, but for the airline that had enabled him. Within, the air was heavy, taut with the expectation of reckoning. Julian Carr entered not in uniform but in the dull gray of custody. His once proud stride faltered as whispers rose around the gallery. The same man who had lorded his authority over passengers now seemed smaller, diminished, his hands clasped tightly as though they could shield him from the eyes of the world. His face was pale, his lips pressed thin, the familiar smirk replaced by a nervous twitch. He avoided looking at Adrian, but the effort only revealed his guilt more clearly. Adrian sat calmly at the witness stand, his posture straight, his gaze steady. He was not the furious father the public had imagined. Instead, he embodied precision, measured, composed, every movement deliberate. He waited patiently as the prosecutor began the questioning, each word framed like a blade being sharpened. When asked to describe what had happened, Adrian spoke clearly, his voice resonant in the silent room. "He took my son's bottle. He replaced it. And what he gave back was not milk, but poison," Adrian said, his tone unwavering. His eyes flickered briefly to Julian, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was not a mistake. It was an act of cruelty. And it was not the first time the courtroom leaned in, breaths held as Adrian began unfolding the hidden history Marcus had uncovered. He revealed documents showing Julian's long record of complaints, parents who had whispered of mistreatment, passengers who had described his contempt, all buried by settlements and silence. The prosecutor displayed them one by one, pages projected on the courtroom screen. With each revelation, Julian seemed to shrink further into his seat, his shoulders curling inward as though bracing against invisible blows. The defense tried to interject, painting Julian as a man under stress, a victim of circumstance. But the evidence was too sharp, too overwhelming. And Adrian, in his calm precision, dismantled every attempt to excuse cruelty. He did not raise his voice, he did not indulge in theatrics. He simply laid out the truth, piece by piece, with the efficiency of a strategist who knew that every detail mattered. The tension rose when a witness, the businessman who had filmed the incident, took the stand. His voice trembled at first, but as he replayed the memory of Julian's sneer and Noah's choking gasps, his conviction hardened. "I saw it," he declared, pointing toward Julian. "I saw him watch as that child suffered." He smiled. The words hung in the air like a weight no one could lift. Julian's attorney attempted one final defense, insisting that Adrian's confrontation in the hangar disqualified him as a credible voice. But the irony was not lost on anyone. The very act meant to be his downfall had only illuminated his resolve. The jury watched Adrian, not as a man consumed by revenge, but as one who had turned pain into purpose. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, sensing the significance of every word. Fathers in the gallery gripped their sons' hands tighter. The air was charged with something larger than the case itself, a recognition that this was no longer about one man or one child, but about accountability for all. When asked if he sought personal revenge, Adrian's response was steady, his eyes never leaving the jury. "I do not stand here for revenge. I stand here because no parent should fear that cruelty will go unanswered. I stand because discipline is not suffering and power is not licensed to harm. This is not about me. This is about every family that deserves safety when they fly." The prosecutor nodded, his face grave. The judge watched silently, hands folded, while Julian trembled openly now, the reality of his downfall finally sinking in. The air felt heavy, the silence broken only by the scratching of pens and the clicking of cameras from the press pool. As Adrian stepped down from the stand, the gallery erupted into murmurs. Some saw a hero, others a man who had walked too close to the edge of vengeance, but none could deny the strength of his words. Julian sat motionless, his once defiant chin now lowered, the arrogance dissolved into shame. The chapter closed not with fire, but with clarity. Adrian's role was no longer to avenge, but to ensure the future was changed. He had transformed from grieving father into a voice that could no longer be ignored. And as the cameras outside prepared to broadcast the outcome to the world, the truth of the moment stood unshaken. Justice was no longer personal. It had become universal. The press conference began with the sharp click of cameras and the restless hum of reporters waiting for their first glimpse of Adrian Keene. The room, a grand hall of glass and polished wood inside the Crescent Towers Conference Center, was packed wall to wall. The glow of television lights reflected off the sleek podium where microphones stood like clustered sentinels. And then, through the side doors, Adrian entered, not alone, but with his young son balanced carefully on his lap as he sat down. The murmur of the crowd softened instantly. Noah, small and fragile yet brimming with life, clutched a toy airplane in his tiny hand and giggled as he waved it toward the cameras. That sound, a child's laugh, cut through the tense silence like sunlight breaking a storm. For many in the room, it was the first reminder that this was not just a corporate scandal or a courtroom battle. It was a story of a father and his son who had survived what no one should have endured. Adrian adjusted his microphone with deliberate calm. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, but his eyes carried the faint shadows of nights spent without rest. He glanced once at Noah, then at the hundreds of faces before him, reporters, investors, regulators, even a handful of parents who had come in solidarity. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm yet gentle, the tone of a man who had carried his grief through fire and turned it into resolve. "Months ago," he began, "I boarded a plane with only one goal, to arrive safely with my son. That flight nearly ended his life, but what could have broken us instead gave us a mission." The cameras clicked faster, recording every word. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his hands resting near the edge of the podium. His expression shifted from sorrow to determination as he revealed the next chapter of his journey. "Today, I am announcing the creation of the Noah Foundation," he declared, his voice rising in strength. "Its purpose is simple, to protect children from mistreatment during travel, and to ensure that no family suffers as mine did." Applause thundered through the hall, though Adrian himself remained still, his gaze unwavering. He was not speaking for approval, he was speaking for change. Behind the podium, Marcus Vare, his loyal operations chief, stood quietly among the staff. Marcus's eyes followed every movement of his friend, proud but wary. Later, as the applause dimmed, he leaned close enough to whisper without disrupting the room. "Julian is still silent in his cell," Marcus reminded, his tone low but steady. "His name carries only shame now. He'll never rise from it." Adrian gave no outward reaction, his jaw tightening slightly. For a brief moment, the cameras caught that flicker of emotion, a storm held in check. He did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in the suffering of another man. His victory was here, on this stage, with Noah alive and smiling in his lap. Reporters pressed forward, questions rising like waves. "Mr. Keene, do you feel justice has been served?" one asked. Adrian paused, studying the crowd. He allowed silence to stretch, his fingers brushing gently across Noah's small hand, grounding himself in the moment. Finally, he answered, "Justice is not measured by one man's punishment. It is measured by whether the system changes, and that is why we are here." His words carried across the room, heavy with meaning. Some nodded solemnly, others scribbled furiously in notebooks, aware that this was more than a press event. It was a declaration of war against cruelty disguised as service. As the conference wore on, Adrian revealed the Foundation's initiatives: training programs for airline staff, independent oversight committees, and emergency protections for passengers traveling with children. Each announcement was met with murmurs of approval, but beneath the optimism ran a deeper current of unease. Some reporters whispered to each other, speculating if the powerful CEO might use his influence to wage battles far beyond the scope of one airline. Foreshadowing lingered in the air. This was not the end of Adrian Keene's crusade. It was only the first stone cast into a widening lake. When the final question was asked and the last camera light dimmed, Adrian rose, lifting Noah gently from his lap. The boy clutched his toy airplane close, pressing it against his father's chest. For the first time in months, Adrian smiled, not the sharp smile of a strategist, but the weary, unguarded smile of a father who had nearly lost everything. He did not look toward the shadows where Julian's name still lingered. He looked only at his son, knowing that was where victory truly lived. The conference ended with applause that swelled like a tide, echoing through the hall long after Adrian stepped away from the podium. Reporters called out, their voices trailing, but Adrian no longer needed to speak. His message had already taken flight, carried in every broadcast, every headline, and every trembling heart that heard him. As he stood at the exit, he turned once more to the crowd and delivered a single line, measured, deliberate, unforgettable. The hall fell into complete silence and then erupted into thunderous clapping. His words became the closing note of the day, a promise etched into memory. When cruelty takes flight, justice must soar higher. A minute later, the father struck back. The same bottle that poisoned his baby became the flight attendant's punishment. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and abuse of authority in everyday settings. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke reflection on accountability in public service, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and equality.